Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Chicago. For those of you who are coming in, we have arranged a beautiful day for you, so we're delighted you're here. My name is Niamh King, and I'm the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content here at the Chicago Council, and we're delighted to be welcoming Dr. Amy Liu. We are on the record, and we're being live streamed, so please silence your phones. Some of you may know, for nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement with the world. So we're delighted today to be talking about global cities, as this is some of what we do. And also, we're very delighted to be partnering with the AAO. As you know, this is a keynote for the Design Matters Conference. The AAO conference seeks to spur broader interest in architecture, urbanism, and culture by bringing together leaders in multiple sectors. And a large thanks goes out to Michael Wood and his colleagues, Mary and Hallie. Thank you very much for working with us so closely on this. It's been a great partnership. And like the AAO, the Council wants to promote a cross-sector dialogue on the power and limitation of global cities. We have a big conference that we do every year in June, the Chicago Forum on Global Cities. We run it with the Financial Times. We already have the dates for next year and some fantastic speakers and mayors confirmed. So So I'll be back up to moderate the Q&A with Amy. We'll be taking questions on mic, so if you want to pop onto your phone, you'll see some instructions about Conferences I.O. It's a great way to ask questions. We can see what's of most interest to the audience, and we can also take them directly from you. But now, if you would join me in welcoming to the stage Lynn Osmond, who's the President and CEO of the Chicago Architecture Foundation, and she'll introduce our speaker. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Niamh. And on behalf of my fellow trustees and board members from the Association of Architecture Organizations, I welcome you, and I'm very happy to be here this morning. And I want to thank the Council on Global Affairs for their partnering with us on this morning's presentation. We've been doing a lot with them since they started their initiative on Global Forum for Cities, which has been really a great opportunity to do a spotlight on what are the issues that are affecting urbanization and the built environment in our global cities. And we're now happy to expand that collaboration to be working with them also with the Association of Architecture Organizations that is actually headquartered at CAF here in the city of Chicago. We've got a great crowd from AAO, as we call it, and we've got over 33 U.S. cities and 9 countries represented. And then we've also got a delegation in here from Toronto today. So it's a very international forum to hear about Amy speaking about international cities. The Design Matters Conference actually travels around. Every year we're in a different city across America, and now we've actually affiliated with the biennial, so that in the odd years we're now in Chicago celebrating this wonderful architecture biennial that was started for the first time in 2017. Now, it's a real pleasure to introduce a powerful thinker on cities, Amy Liu, who's President and Director of the Metropolitan Policy Programming, Brookings. Amy conducts deep research on the focus of shaping cities and the decisions, characteristics, economic and public policies that help cities either thrive or fall off the pace. Today, she'll help us think the big picture about a few of the most powerful disruptors changing the face of most of all of our cities. Her expertise is much sought after by private and public sector leaders. Of late, her consulting work has engaged leaders from Chicago to Phoenix, New York to New Orleans. In addition to being a very busy author, editor, and frequent public speaker, Amy served in numerous high-level appointments and advisory positions, including support roles of our nation's Secretary of Commerce, the U.S. Banking Committee, and as a past role to Special Assistant to HUD Secretary Henry Cisnero. She holds a degree in social policy and urban studies from Northwestern University. And please welcome Amy.
Great. Thank you, Lynn, for the generous introduction. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm excited to be in Chicago. I am excited to be part of the Design Matters Conference, to be part of the Chicago Architectural Biennial, and to be hosted with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm not an architect, although it's been my dream job since I've studied all the great buildings and the planning history here in Chicago. But I do love cities, and I believe everyone in this room does too. And we dedicate our time and our craft to making cities healthy, vibrant places to live, to work, and to raise a family. Now, those efforts matter more now. I think it's safe to say that we have a national discourse and a set of policies that are turning their backs on climate change, on the poor and the working class, on our values as a nation of immigrants and people of all races and religions. So rather than take us backwards, the nation needs our cities to move us forward. And that future will be hyperglobal, more digital, more urban, more multiracial, and multi-ethnic. But here's my concern. These very same forces of progress can also be great sources of division. For instance, technology creates opportunity and it destroys it for others. It favors the highly skilled and it abandons those that can't keep pace. The future, if not well managed, may be one of wider disparities and greater instability. So we as local leaders need to build inclusive city and regional economies that radically adapt to disruption and future-proof our cities. So let me start by what we at Brookings believe should be the penultimate goal, that cities and metro areas should achieve 3 goals: growth, prosperity, and inclusion. Now, growth is fundamental because with more jobs and expanding output, it creates opportunities for people. Wages are more likely to rise, poverty to decline when there's high demand for labor. We've also added a measure on young firms because there's increasing evidence that business dynamism results in more job openings, creating opportunities for people to improve their earnings. But that growth ought to be prosperous. Growth of bad jobs is not necessarily better. So we need quality growth, and that means through rising productivity of firms and workers, through new innovations or skills development, and that income generated from increasing productivity raises the living standards for the entire population. But to achieve inclusion, higher standards of living must raise the employment and the incomes of all segments of our community, closing disparities by race and by place. So let's see how well these trends play out across the 100 largest metropolitan areas. Now, according to the Brookings Metro Monitor, 63 metro areas out of 100 experienced growth in jobs, output, and entrepreneurialism between 2010 and 2015, including Chicago. And this reflects the steady expansion in the broader economy. Yet of those 63, only 30 experienced improvements in productivity and living standards, in part because a lot of the recent job growth has been in low productivity sectors like retail, hospitality, and healthcare. And then only 8 metropolitan areas made additional progress on inclusion, improving employment and wages for whites and people of color. Now, I added this slide to reinforce the point that the nation's economic growth is not felt by most people. While we did see the release of this week's federal income data that showed real progress in median household incomes in the past year, this line graph by Thomas Piketty using up to 2016 data shows that as a whole, the bottom 50% of income earners, the middle class, the working class, the poor, have made no ground. So the bulk of the nation's income gains have accrued to top earners. So the bottom line is that our cities, our metro areas must do a better job to create opportunities that lift the economic prospects of more people. But to do this, we need to not look only at the historic policies and attitudes that hold us back. We also have to prepare people for where the economy is heading. And that's why I want to talk about disruption. Our cities face major headwinds, and I will cover 3 points today. First, I want to review the disruptive forces that are facing cities and metropolitan areas. Second, I want to do a deep dive, particularly on technology and its transformative effect on the economic landscape. And third, I want to offer a starting framework for how cities can adapt to disruption. So let me start with the first point, the disruptive forces facing cities. Now, cities face a whole set of macroeconomic forces that are not new, but they are accelerating. These forces, globalization, technology, urbanization, demographic change, they are upending existing systems, our norms, causing major tumult for workers, industries, and communities. So let's examine each of these interrelated dynamics in turn and review how they can exacerbate disparities. So let's start with globalization. Now, globalization has indeed slowed down in the past decade, as this chart shows, But trade between nations remains a significant part of the global economy, generating nearly 40% of world economic value. In that regard, trade has enormous benefits, including the fact that firms that sell products or services abroad tend to generate more revenue, hire more people, and pay better wages than firms that do not. Yet, as voters made very clear their frustration in the last election, globalization also left many workers without jobs for extended periods of unemployment. So on the left is a map of the more than 2 million workers in the past two decades who received federal adjustment assistance as a result of losing a job due to trade. These workers live in counties that span the urban, suburban, and rural landscape, with 70% of such workers living in large and small metropolitan areas. However, if you take a look at the dark red spots on the map, you'll see that the trade pain was most felt in the industrial communities in the Midwest and the South. Now, I would say the problem isn't so much globalization, but the failure of our public policies to help people and to help communities adjust to the new world order. So the question is, have we learned our lesson as we face a bigger disruption called the digital revolution? So I will come back to that. Urbanization. This has been called the urban century. Not only do the majority of the world's population lives in cities, but we are becoming more urban even here in the United States. In 2016, 86% of the US population lived in metropolitan areas. That is up by 6% from 2010, while rural areas continue to shrink. So yes, urbanization itself creates winners and losers. The economy continues to favor agglomeration, the clustering of related talent, innovation, industry, and infrastructure, and that benefits core cities, large metros, while older Rust Belt communities, smaller metros, rural areas struggle to preserve jobs and economic activity. Therefore, this is not just an urban versus rural problem. Even among cities, there is great variation in economic health, such as the uneven growth of jobs in advanced industries. And we all know that within our cities, our urban form is creating a patchwork of opportunity and neglect. Chicago is like many cities and metro areas in the country. Poverty has grown over the last decade, even though we've seen some improvements in the past year based on this week's census data. But the poverty has become more suburban, and poverty is increasingly concentrated. 80% of cities and 93% of suburbs in the United States experience an increase in the number of poor residents living in neighborhoods where 20% or more of the residents are also poor. So this concentration and isolation of the poor hampers residents' access to good schools, access to quality jobs, positive role models, safe streets. Demography. My colleague Bill Fry claims that the U.S. is going through a diversity explosion, where the rapid shift to a majority-minority future is spreading from the outside in, from the traditional coastal immigrant gateways and urban centers on the coast, to the heartland and to southern cities. But we're also diversifying from the bottom up, where the younger generation is browning and the older generation is increasingly white. So for instance, in 2016, for the first time, the majority of school-aged children in our country are children of color. And in many metro areas, the millennial generation, the young workforce we depend on, and preparing them for this disruptive period, they are also majority-minority. These are cities like in Los Angeles, San Antonio, Atlanta, and Chicago, while metros like Pittsburgh are diversifying, but still majority white. Now, the transition to a nation where racial and ethnic, so we're transitioning to a time when there will be no racial and ethnic group that is a majority. And that is creating huge discomfort for some, waging a cultural war in the nation that erupted in violence in Charlottesville. Now, it's hard to separate the cultural divides and attitudes from the deep economic disparities we see by race. And this is because the enduring structural racial barriers to economic mobility for Blacks and Hispanics are kind of rooted in our lack of will and understanding of the unique experience faced by Blacks and our immigrants. But at the same time, we also need to find a different narrative that acknowledges that whites too face economic hardships. Because if we can't, we will feed a cultural divide that will make difficult the reforms we need to aid the poor and the working class. And finally, technology. The rapid diffusion of digital technologies through our businesses, through our homes, through our cars, things in our pocket, they deserve its own discussion. So I'm going to talk about technology and how it is really changing the way we live, work, and the way we shop. We are witnessing a rapid spread in robotics, cloud computing, mobile apps, big data, machine learning, the Internet of Things. There is no doubt that digitalization is vastly expanding the promise and the potential of the American economy. But if left unmanaged, it may also have a more devastating effect on workers and industries than did trade. So what do I mean by this? Tech is disrupting industries. The manufacturing sector, for instance, it is stronger, more productive today, thanks to technology adoption. And for instance, as you can see here, manufacturing is no longer the jobs machine it once was. In 1980, it took 25 jobs to produce $1 million in output. Today, it takes only 5 jobs. The gig economy is also disrupting the transportation industry. Lots of talk about Uber, lots of talk about Lyft, and the oncoming possibility of driverless vehicles. Now, Uber was founded in 2009. By 2012 to 2014 period, Brookings found that the ride-hailing industry is not only complementing, but replacing formal payroll jobs in the transportation sector in cities like Bay Area, Columbus, and Indianapolis. And these numbers reflect those who report taxi and driving as a primary source of income, which raises larger questions about stable work and good benefits. But I was also wondering about the rise of ride-hailing businesses on the built environment. We do still need to understand more how tech will impact urban form and function, but conversations I've had with experts working on autonomous vehicles predict that the future still requires a heavy emphasis on mass transit, because autonomous vehicles will make driving or owning a car more convenient. It actually may reduce the demand for transit, potentially increasing traffic congestion. So all the focus on AV or app-based rides will still require investing in the most efficient way possible to move lots of people around a city. So that's why I produced this slide. It reflects a study produced by the City of New York about the impact of ride-hailing services on traffic congestion. It did find that app-based rides had no impact on congestion yet, but the more alarming finding was that the shift away from taxis was creating a revenue shortfall for transit. Because in New York, fees and surcharges on taxis fund the MTA, and it funds investments for accessibility, such as paratransit or handicap access in fleets. The reduction in the taxi fleet is hurting the financing of multimodal solutions. Another way that tech impacts place is the distribution of opportunity between places. The concern now is, will tech hollow out the country? This slide shows that the bulk of recent jobs in digital technology has been highly concentrated in select metropolitan areas like San Francisco, New York, San Jose, Boston, Chicago. What's more, just 10 metropolitan areas captured more than half of the nation's new tech growth. Simply, the strong are getting stronger, creating greater divergence between our cities. Thus, the combination of digitalization and urbanization is raising some very hard questions about how older industrial places are going to keep pace with the tech-rich centers of the United States in this digital age. Last piece on tech, the impact on people and workers. A recent report by McKinsey found that half of all tasks could be automated using today's technologies, with the most vulnerable occupations being middle-wage jobs, such as in data analytics and some routine manual labor. And one example of automation is the massive deployment of robots. This Brookings map shows the highest concentrations of robot adoption in metropolitan areas. Not surprisingly, huge swaths of the industrial belt in the Midwest and the South have turned to machines than people to do the work, reinforcing the efficiency gains now in manufacturing, but also the large numbers of dislocated workers from trade and technology in this region. And rapid digitalization across industries means we need a different workforce to keep pace with the needs of the industries. This chart is from a forthcoming Brookings report, which we hope to release next month, which demonstrates the dramatic demand by employers for workers with digital literacy. And when I say digital literacy, I mean people who have a specific knowledge of computers and electronics or who use computers routinely in their daily tasks. In 2002, so just 5 years ago, 55% of all jobs did not require a person to have computer literacy. Oops. So those jobs have shrunk to just 30% by 2016, while the demand for middle and high computer capabilities have grown by 25 percentage points. So in just 4 short years, the responsibilities of numerous jobs, including administrative assistants, tool and die makers, firefighters, police officers, nurses, real estate agents, jobs that are on-ramps to the middle class, they have rapidly digitalized. Our report also finds that people who know how to use Salesforce, Photoshop, Microsoft packages like Excel often move into middle and high digital jobs and they get paid more. However, Black and Hispanic Americans are disproportionately employed in lower paying occupations that require low levels of digital literacy. These include home health aides, truck drivers, restaurant workers, landscapers. At the same time, Black and Hispanic Americans are underrepresented in highly digital, higher paying occupations like computer programmers, architects and engineers, managers and doctors. So let me close with how city and regional leaders can mitigate the harms of the machine age and help our people and communities adapt. And that's essential if we are to achieve the goals of growth, prosperity, and inclusion, which I outlined at the beginning of my talk. So, I know, bear with me here. Amazon's announcement to establish a second headquarters with potentially 50,000 workers and 8 million square feet of office space has indeed created a feeding frenzy among cities. Now, if you set aside the horse race, if you set aside the crazy, wasteful subsidies, there's actually a bigger message here. Amazon, through its RFQ, is powerfully signaling what cities need to be a leader in the digital age. On people, what did the RFP say? Cities need a strong technical workforce, and they must demonstrate that they have good computer science programming in K-12 system. They have to have strong technical certification programs in their community colleges. They have to have strong engineering in their higher ed program. In all this, the city must exhibit a culture of tolerance and diversity. On place, the RFP reads like a planner's dream. Bike lanes, light rail, transit, trams, walking, multimodal transportation options, modern digital infrastructure, and an embrace of energy-efficient lighting in buildings, composting and recycling, public plazas and green space. In short, an embrace of sustainability practices. So Amazon's RFP, in short, shows us what the digital economy demands, and it reflects how our policies and programs must shift. So our strategies should help people, places, firms adapt and prosper in this era of globalization, digitization, urbanization, and demographic change. To help people, our strategies should equip young and older workers with the skills and supports they need to take part in a fast-changing economy. This could include providing our young people with meaningful work experience so they can improve their soft skills and expand their professional networks. This could also include apprenticeships, firm-based IT training courses, and rewarding firms who hire ex-offenders. How we urbanize and develop place matters to economic growth and opportunity. We already talked about transit and broadband, but in general, our strategies should connect neighborhoods, core cities, older suburbs to regional opportunities and themselves be places of economic inclusion. So for instance, yes, we can revitalize downtowns, but leaders should also revitalize a network of innovation corridors, neighborhood job centers, economic hubs throughout a city and metro, so residents, no matter where they live, can be close to opportunity. And there is a role for public policy and civic action to spur business dynamism, helping small and mid-sized firms survive and expand through periods of disruption. So rather than simply attracting companies, we do need to create entrepreneurship ecosystems or help existing manufacturers adopt new technologies in a way that modernizes their products and trains and retains their workers. So let me close with this. In his new book, Nobel Prize-winning journalist Tom Friedman said, "We are living in an age of accelerations." And the reason we have so much discontent, so much dislocation in the economy right now is that society and we as public policy leaders have not kept pace with acceleration. The bright spot for him is cities and localities, because it is at the local level where trust, adaptive solutions, cross-sector collaborations can be found. So, the lesson for us, we need to look up, we need to look ahead, and we have to adapt, because the nation depends on it. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. That was wonderful and some great data. And actually, I love the point that you ended on. I heard Tom Friedman speak recently, and he was focusing on STEM, as we all do, and we will with Amazon in Chicago. We'll get to that. But he said that there's another part to it that we need to add, and that's empathy. So we need STEmpathy, and I think that speaks to your, he's very good at coining great phrases, isn't he? But that speaks to your point about a public policy and policies and planning that that are very inclusive. So, dominating the headlines, a couple of things. Amazon, we know Chicago's going to get it right. It's a done deal. I saw new bike lanes being dug this morning down to Hyde Park. So they're 8 miles. We took it seriously, the request. Talk to us about Amazon versus entrepreneurship as a driver for, 50,000 jobs, one big company. But some people like Steve Case talk about entrepreneurs. That's a very different model. Can you kind of square that off for us, or talk to us about how they work together for creating inclusive growth in cities?
So what I tell a lot of leaders is business attraction overall generates 3% of job growth in a state. The bulk of job creation comes from startups and the expansion of existing businesses. And within startups and existing businesses, the evidence is increasing that it is really the slow and steady growth of mid-sized companies that creates jobs. And so we need to figure out the big message is the real growth comes from focusing on your existing companies and your existing ecosystem. That said, Amazon is really different from Foxconn. Because Foxconn is going to be a big factory probably in a green field, holed up in a tight campus with robots doing the bulk of the work. But Amazon is going to it could take away jobs. Think about this, 50,000 workers doesn't necessarily mean it's new workers. It could take 50,000 workers from existing positions and steal from other firms. But anyway, it's 50,000 jobs in a tight campus with real catalytic ability, higher spillovers than sort of other traction deals. So it will probably create real benefit for cities depending on the kind of community that wins it. But overall, that is not the way economic development is done.
Okay, great. Now, one of the things, Richard Florida, another cities guru like yourself, had talked about the creative class, but there's also a conversation about a patchwork metropolis, which I think some of your maps showed that. Can you talk to us, and since we're in an audience of architects, I know you'd like to be an architect in a parallel universe, but you're not. Could you talk about what people thinking about the built and planned world could possibly do to ameliorate a patchwork metropolis instead of all of us thriving together?
Yeah, my first thought about the patchwork metropolis is that the way to solve this problem is that it has to be regional in scope. That places of opportunity and places of distress are now have spread across our entire metropolitan area. And the way to think about opportunity now is really regional, so that's one. The second is for the planning and architecture field, I think this is hard, and I would really welcome folks in the room's feedback on this. It's really hard to solve this site by site. And in fact, when I think about the history of all the work we've done on neighborhood redevelopment, right? And we actually have given CDCs more tools. We have, and we have a lot more CDC tax credits and financing and a whole network of CDFIs around the country. But the number of high poverty neighborhoods have doubled in the last decade. So somehow, really tight place-based investments by themselves, in the absence of connecting to the growth opportunities in the larger regional economy, I think that's what's happening, is we're still working in really siloed approaches. So I think we have to kind of break, be a little bit more creative about how community development connects to regional economic development, how skills development in neighborhoods can be married together to where the jobs are, no matter where they are. Transit planning, being more coordinated. One of the things that we've talked about in this regard, and that our team talks about, is how do we work with the MPOs in a different way? MPOs do a great mapping around amenity centers and job centers, but what if every single metropolitan area committed to create 50 opportunity areas at the same time? Full commitment to affordability and jobs and transit and other things, instead of doing it one neighborhood at a time. So I feel like we have the tools, we just haven't figured out a way to bring all the expertise in a way that attacks this at the right scale.
And so you talked about leaders of cities. I mean, in our world of global cities work at the council, mayors are the rock stars right now. It used to be central bankers, now it's mayors. We also talked, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned like climate change. We're of the view that cities have answers that federal governments don't have. Yeah. So how do you balance, I think what you're talking about before is policies to kind of enact these corridors and these opportunity areas. Where's the money and the impetus for this going to come from? Is it public-private partnerships? Where's that going to come from?
So a couple thoughts. I talked to a mayor recently because there's been so much attention on the power of mayors in the last, particularly since the election, and how mayors need to step out now in the absence of, since pulling out of Paris. Mayors going to have to step up on protecting immigrants in the face of DACA and everything else. But a mayor told me, when I came into office, this person's going to be nameless, but when I came into office, I just thought I had all this power. And I was an executive. And then I realized, boy, my real job as a mayor was to ignite the civic infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And that the mayor's only job is to organize the civic class, the neighborhoods, the business leadership, the universities, in a way that convenes them, moves them, incentivizes them, motivates them, give a vision, a way that moves the thing forward, because he can't do most of this work alone. And all the big challenges of the day, the things that I talked about, are way outside the purview of what City Hall can do with its own dollars. So I think what we're seeing is a lot more intensive creative collaborations. And one of the things I think about is the mayor role has so changed. And I always tell mayors, please stop talking about the fact that picking up trash is a bipartisan thing or a nonpartisan thing, because you do so much more than picking up trash, Yeah. And so they're doing a lot of creative work and jujitsu around these complex issues, but the partnerships are really key, and the quality and capacity of their institutions in a city matter to this work, as many of you all know. But the second thing I would say is we have to admit at some level there's a limit to city-only action. And that cities at the end of the creatures of the state, for those of you in Illinois who know this very well. And so I would love to see a future where states and cities work in tighter alignment, because I think the tea leaves from Washington, whether it is a Republican administration or the next, future Democratic administration, is the administrative state at the federal level has really shrunk. And we are continuing to send more responsibility and more resources down to state and local level. And so now it's really about the states and cities. And how do we get that right, and that partnership right? So that's the next challenge.
Well, I think you could give us a lesson in Illinois about how to, in fact, J.B. Pritzker was filming an ad in the lobby this morning here, coincidentally. And what about the private sector? I mean, you talk about igniting the civic infrastructure. We're sitting here on the cusp of Millennium Park, which I think Chicago likes to cite as the great example of city and private sector working together. How big of a role do you think that should play or is playing?
The private sector?
Yeah, the private sector in developing. Because cities and states have to get together.
Yeah.
How do you see the private sector playing into that?
Huge. My whole talk is, cities are places of people and settlement patterns. They're places of, they're people, they're places, but they're also economies. And when I deliberately chose the word inclusive economies because I think at the end of the day, the basic threshold is people want to just make enough money to support their families. That's really what it is. And so cities have to be able to create the conditions for that. Private sector is so critical as employers, as investors in major initiatives, as partners in growth.
Yeah.
And I think that one of our experience is that as much as we have seen the rise of public-private partnerships, getting the business leaders to talk about equity, to talk about why lifting up people who have been at the margin of the economy is good for them and their bottom line, that is still a work in progress. But yet, they are so critical in making choices about wages, about whether or not they offer scholarships to their employees for training programs, whether or not they're going to create slots for summer youth, ex-offenders, or people with criminal records in their workplace. So I feel like the private sector role needs to continue to evolve to be even better partners and people be present on these issues.
Great. So, Amy, you've done some fantastic work on New Orleans.
Oh, sure.
Well, in addition to other stuff, but on
Yes.
New Orleans.
Yep.
So, could you talk to us? I mean, we're just fresh off Harvey, Irma. I don't know what happened to Jose, but obviously maybe nothing huge because we didn't hear any more about him again. What lessons do you take about? I think the word resilience is huge in this. From what you learned about Katrina, and I believe Rita, was it, that you did on your studies in New Orleans that we could take today regarding Houston and the Keys and kind of South Florida?
So, I think embedded in my definition of inclusive economies in the talk today is the word resilience. Resilience not just in the sustainability term, but in the sense of the ability for a community to bounce back from a shock. Whether that shock is trade dislocation, whether it is about technology eliminating occupations wholesale, or whether it's a major storm. And so that's about policies, that is about the capacities of individuals, but it's also about have we learned something when the shock happens, that we do something different when we come out. So one of the things that I've just learned from having followed natural disaster shocks in communities is in every single one of these cases, at least in the recent history, is that it was a transformative moment. And so for New Orleans, Katrina was a lesson about disparities because Katrina essentially exposed what was there before. Everyone knew about it, but it made how we build a community in a way that's more inclusive and obviously more safe and sustainable, it made it even more top of mind. And the community groups are much more empowered and the public leaders now get it and it's almost in the groundwater of the way they work. After the tsunami in Japan destabilized all the nuclear reactors, it sparked a huge policy conversation about that nation's dependence on nuclear energy. So now we have Harvey in Houston. And it has a very billboard opportunity as a teachable moment around land use and planning and sustainability and resilience. And I think it's still early to tell whether or not Texas, even the Republican leadership in Congress, will take that lesson. Because right before the storm hit, the administration passed an executive order as part of streamlining environmental regulations to move infrastructure spending. They removed a standard to improve infrastructure to high standards of climate change resilience. It's gone. And that's exactly what we need if we want to protect taxpayers from having to kind of repeat bailout communities. You would think that would matter to fiscal hawks in Washington or fiscal hawks in Texas. So I think it's, I would love to be hopeful that they will maybe not frame it as a climate change, but as a fiscal responsibility to build differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's too bad that these teachable moments take such devastation, right? I mean, I wonder if there's a way to get rid of that step before the fiscal hawks and people who are interested in climate change change it. So we have some great questions from the audience. You can put your arm up. I'll ask a couple first from the iPad. So give me a second, because something you touched on in your presentation, I never heard the word browning used as a verb before, so thank you for that. How do you think the younger, more diverse generation entering the workplace will affect cultural tensions? You briefly touched on Charlottesville.
Well, I think it's creating cultural tensions now, and I think that the conversations I have with folks right now is how do we navigate this really complicated period? Because we have both now an emboldened white supremacist movement, and then we had a very rich discussion around the Black Lives Movement. And is it possible to, how do you reconcile these two realities happening in the United States right now? What I feel we need is to, I know narrative seems very unsatisfying, but I think that we need to redefine the American dream. I think we need to find a way to talk about the American dream that doesn't start from a place of created by white people, frankly. And that we now need an American dream that reflects the diversity of experiences of the people that are here. And that they see themselves in the language and the promise of this country. And we don't have leaders who talk that way. We actually, I think, do pit race cards against each other. So I think we need to figure out a way to talk about multiracial in a way that isn't a threat to whites, that maybe finds a way for us to talk about our shared economic insecurities, but also addresses, again, the structural barriers that face people of color. So I think this is complicated, but that's where we're heading. And if we can't figure this out, I think it's going to make the politics of the policies that we need a lot more complicated.
Thanks. Yeah, there was a question, right? Just for the ground rules for the questions, wait, raise your arm, wait for the mic, and make sure your question's a question. Yeah, Kate there, please, in the fifth row. Thanks. The mic's there, thanks, because we're live streaming.
Right, thank you so much. This is so interesting, and it's complicated. I have kind of a very basic question, but when you talked about city equality and you went from 68 to 30 to 8, was that Milwaukee that is regional that has gone? I wasn't sure if it was Milwaukee or if it was Chicago.
That is in the 8?
The 8, correct.
Milwaukee.
Okay, because one of my things about all of this, and I've been working in global business for about 20 years, is information sharing and having delivery methods, because it seems to me that if we can share best practices globally, like you mentioned, the tsunami, what is a way that's not fake news or intimidating that we can develop delivery systems around sharing best practices? Like, how can Chicago study what Milwaukee did? Or, you know what I mean? I'm very interested in legitimizing information and making it sort of accessible to a lot of different people, not just sort of the elite. You know, if we're talking about inclusion, I mean, this is very complicated, but I just, I thought, okay, Milwaukee, so let's study what Milwaukee did. But what is the call to action on sharing best practices?
I think it's a great, it's definitely a great question in an environment now where information and leadership is so democratized, and not only democratized from the media cycle in DC and Washington down to localities, but even in communities, it has to go from grass tops to grassroots, as you were saying. And I find, as you know, and we all talk about it, the way we get our information is so fragmented today. So I think everything is networked. And all I would say is I hope that the work that we did today provided some insights for you. If you, a lot of this stuff is public. In fact, when we wrote a piece that talked about what was in the attributes of those 8 places that made them inclusive. And I think we have more to understand about why Milwaukee. We sort of put out some assumptions about them. But it would be great if there was a convening on that, if there were peer trips, like you were saying, around that, to create that kind of peer learning. Because at the end of the day, it needs to go beyond awareness to action.
So I think the answer is attend more AAO conferences and more Chicago Council conferences. Simple as that. Okay, let's take the question in the back row there, please. The gentleman with the glasses. Yep, right there, second to last row.
Mark Anderson. I'm wondering, I've seen a lot on the internet about universal basic income and whether that might be pursued at the state or local level, because Jeremy Rifkin and others wrote long ago about the wage of the machine. So with automation, might some income come not from employment, but from a supplemental source to supplement employment, so we don't constantly chase our tail in trying to fill the income gap?
Yeah. I am not an expert on the universal basic income. There are certainly some progressive organizations that are worried about that because it might actually water down the benefits of food stamps and other things for low-income families. I think the bigger issue is that if there is some basic support for families that are transitioning, it doesn't solve the dignity of work. People just want to have productive time and feel valued. And so universal basic income alone is not sufficient. And I think that's why there are a lot more people who talk about wage insurance. There was a proposal made by a congressman from the Bay Area to double the earned income tax credit as a way of undergirding people from these shocks. But the issue is rewarding work. You know, one of the things that we see in dislocation is that a lot of the workers that are dislocated might have been lost a job 3-4 years from retirement, right? This is not a group of workers who want to do retraining or want to dramatically change their career pathway. They just want to be able to work for 3 or 4 more years until they can tap their retirement. So there are a lot of conversations about, are there ways to tap retirement funds early? That's why wage insurance allows them to move to a different job and not lose wages or earnings in the process of just finding something temporarily for a couple of years. So I think overall your question is, I'm just grateful there is a conversation about the need to do something. I think we need more solutions out there on adjustment policies at the federal, state, and local level.
And I think that's great, Amy, the way you talk about the dignity of work. In fact, people don't always look into that in the numbers, but I think probably anecdotally and maybe from some of the people you've spoken to, that the dignity of productivity and work is so hugely important to people feeling not disenfranchised. Yeah, right here, Lauren Knobloch in the second row, please. My numbers are off today. It's the third row. I can't count. I apologize.
Hi, my name is Lauren Knobloch. You talk about growth and prosperity as being 2 very, very important things for city, and you have an inclusiveness. But it seems to me growth and prosperity will be driven naturally by the business community, by small businesses, large businesses. They're highly incentivized to make those things happen, and as a result, it seems to me there's a high likelihood they will happen. But on the other hand, if the business community, they may well think that inclusiveness is sort of a good thing generally, but it's going to be hard to convince them it's really good for their businesses. So how do you really drive inclusiveness? Things that we think are nice, but we don't have any real incentive to do, don't get done. And I wonder how you drive inclusiveness All right.
Yeah,
That's it.
So I think that there are a couple ways that industries and businesses can be supportive on this. I do, before I answer that, I do want to stress one of the things you said, which is firms right now, firms can't really be at the table on inclusion unless they are stable themselves. One of the things that we learned coming out of the recession is many of them had a hard time joining workforce training conversations because they didn't even know where their own business direction was going. You know, they're seeing the tumult, they're seeing changing demand in their supply chain, they're seeing their OEMs changing preferences. They have to shift and move too. And so they don't even know what products and processes they're going to create that then says what kind of skilled workers I need. So I think that that's why we have business dynamism in there, which is we need to make sure that our firms have the tools they need to really kind of stay nimble in a fast-changing environment. But if they get to a place of stability and growth or have found a path forward, there are a lot of things I think they can do that I think is part of the bottom line. And I know that, I see Mary Sue Barrett here, but you know, I think that investments in workforce housing nearby, it's not just about skilled workers. Being able to be part of the conversation around the supply affordability so I can have my workers nearby is an important contribution. I think we are seeing a lot of firms getting really tired of high turnovers in their companies, and so they are beginning to not just wag their fingers at workforce investment boards for not being able to solve their problems, but actually working in different ways. I'll tell you this. There's a story about GE Appliance Park in Louisville. They reshored their company back into the United States. And when they did that, they knew that the company that they were bringing back from Mexico was going to be a much more modern, tech-oriented company. And so they were re-engineering all their business processes in-house and knew that they needed a completely different workforce. For years, they had a skills gap. They couldn't find the workers in the community. And they did what most firms did, which is just try to hire straight out, maybe say some things to the workforce boards nearby, but nothing changed. And they were really frustrated. And so they took the matters into their own hands. And, you know, it's interesting. They don't lead from a place of inclusion. They lead from a place of self-interest. And they ended up sending out an RFP and said, I will fund any community college partnership that can generate X number of technicians with these kind of skill sets at this volume every year so I can do this a lot easier. And they got a lot of applications. Long story short, they are thrilled. And the partnership that produces this workforce is with the K through 12 system in the west side of Louisville where the public housing developments are. And those high school graduates are coming into the training programs, working in GE, and GE is thrilled. And they, you know, because of self-interest. So I think there's a way to find common ground on these solutions in a way that appeals to business.
Amy, on balance, are you more worried about disruption coming from humanity or coming from nature as you picture how you outlined to us what a great city looks like? On balance, which are you more concerned about?
You know,
The what keeps you up at night question, right?
the what keeps me up at night. I do think that climate change and resilience, as we've seen in the past couple of weeks, is a real concern. So many of our urban centers are in places of high risk and are vulnerable, and we don't really have enough of a public conversation about that. And the administration just deleted a lot of programs around disaster planning, resilience planning on that. But the technology thing is a big deal, too. I do worry that the way technology is going, it will continue to favor the people, the places, and the industries that are already in it. And I do worry about the hollowing out of the middle. There is a rise of the rest conversation. That rest isn't as rising as we would like. And so there's really robust conversations between Silicon Valley leaders, the Steve Cases of the world and others on what can we do to be helpful here. So I think intentionality is really what we need. I think that's the message I want to say to you. These are the things that I worry about. I think what's so fascinating to me when I work with leaders is they don't think about the future. They're so worried about, they're looking down, and they're worried about the things that are immediate to them, that when I talk about disruptive forces, they're like, right? It's too hard, it's too amorphous, it's ambiguous.
Expensive.
Yeah, and I want to make it concrete. I want it very, very clear, because if we don't, I think the numbers are going to get worse. And already I worry that the American modern economy may not be the model for the future if we can't figure this out.
That's a big thought. One quick one and then one final question. May we have a copy of your presentation, and if so, how? That's from the audience. Is that on the Brookings website or the?
I'm not, but I can share it with the hosts who can post it if they would like.
Great. Okay, thanks. And then the last question, which I think a lot of people like a call to action. So while you have a captive audience that works in a certain field, you mentioned the challenges of designing site by site. What more would you like to see advanced by architects and planners? And this question says and how, but I think the and how is their job, right? So your job is to tell them what you'd like to see from people, practitioners in their world.
Okay, so being that I'm not an industry expert on this, I would just say one thing, which is build for what end? Build for what end? Design for what end? Across all sectors, I feel the reason why we're so status quo is that we are stuck on the same outcomes. The economic development field is generally incentivized to grow jobs of any kind. Jobs. But not the quality of the jobs, not where the jobs are located, not who gets access to those jobs, not whether people are prepared for those jobs. I think neighborhood organizations are also sometimes rewarded only around the number of units of affordable housing, whether the retail establishment is going to return capital and market investment for the investors, but not necessarily whether people are better off as a result of the investments. So what I would just say for the architects and planners are, what are the metrics that are governing your work? Whether you think it's helping to achieve some of the larger societal needs today, and if they're not, adjust them.
Amy, you've been really elucidating and thoughtful today. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Amy.
Thank you.
I want to thank our speakers, and on behalf of the Association of Architecture Organizations, we're a group that really educate the public about why architecture and design matters and the importance of